Today I read the article that Tom Hunt, my local MP, wrote in the Ipswich Star, and it's pretty sad reading for anyone trying to fight racism at the moment, because he basically denies its existence in the UK at the moment and says that institutional racism isn't a problem. But I'm glad I did read it, because without knowing it, he's actually highlighted a few key points that I think we do need to address as a country. And he seems to be of the belief, Mr. Hunt, that because he and his associates and friends may not express conscious racist beliefs, or he doesn't see direct racism on a day-to-day basis, he's denying its existence, and specifically institutional racism being a problem in the UK. And he's used inverted commas as well for terms such as unconscious bias and white privilege, white fragility, and institutional racism. And that suggests to me that either he doesn't necessarily believe in these terms, or he doesn't understand these terms, or doesn't understand the true meaning of these terms. So let's give Tom the benefit of the doubt and says that he's just got the wrong end of the stick and doesn't understand these terms, as opposed to dismissing them. And we'll have a look into the definitions of them. So the definition of unconscious bias is that it's when social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. So that is essentially stuff like labelling a certain ethnicity lazy due to their skin colour, which there's evidence again that people do this. White privilege is defined as inherent advantages possessed by a white person on the basis of their race in a society characterized by racial inequality and injustice. So an example of that is that white people are more likely to be, or white people are overly represented in higher class areas of society because of their abilities to be able to produce generational wealth from ancestors before them. White fragility, the definition is discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. So that's essentially what Tom Hunt has done, really, is he's been defensive and deflective in his article, as opposed to actually wanting to address the problem. And institutional racism is a bit difficult because, well, if you followed videos before, we actually looked at what the given definition was, and it was a lot longer than this, but this is just a snippet. It's racial discrimination that has become established as normal behaviour within a society or organisation. So an example of that is black people having increased chances of getting stop and search depending on the colour of their skin. Now, going back to his allegations against people from the Black Lives Matter organisation, I actually can't think of a better case point for my interpretation of white fragility than the reflex reaction that some white people have, which is to pick holes in the fight against racism towards black people, as opposed to trying to understand it. And that's basically what Mr. Hunt's done here. And this is not a personal failure of him, because I think every white person was at the same point and was at the same point at some point in their life, and I include myself in that. And just like we are not born racist, we are not born aware of racism, and we all learn at different times, but it is important that we do all learn. And Tom provides no evidence for his claims that a minority of Black Lives Matter UK representatives want to do any of the acts that he's mentioned, but let's address them for argument's sake. Dismantling capitalism. First of all, I don't think this is Black Lives Matter specific, but you can see why it would be something on their agenda, because they are overly represented in the lower classes of society. And I think this likely depends on where you were born in the class system and your moral principles, but personally for me, I am not against the redistribution of wealth from the elite towards the poverty-stricken people at the bottom of the class system, especially not at the time when we're about to enter one of the worst recessions of our lifetime, probably the worst. But Tom can disagree with that. Abolishing prisons, again, I've not seen any official intent or anything at all actually about this, about abolishing prisons. But the idea of alternative punishment to prison for less severe crimes comes from the fact that it costs more to incarcerate somebody in prison than it does to try and rehabilitate them in society, and it's also less effective, so it's doubly negative on the tax-paying members of the public. And we have a significantly higher imprisonment rate than France and Germany, but our murder and rape rates aren't significantly higher, so something just doesn't add up there. Getting rid of borders, again, I've not seen any official intent from Black Lives Matter to do this at all, but this term is very vague and dangerous, and like capitalism, it depends on your own personal view. I'm not sure what relevance it is at all either, but let's just think about immigration as a whole and how the black and minority ethnic people, for want of a better term, are overly represented in the NHS, for example, because they do so much work there. I mean, where would we be without that? But again, that's a different point about immigration. Defunding the police is the final term he uses, which frustrates me somewhat because it can be a bit misleading, I think, this term. But the idea of defunding the police isn't, think, well, you have to do your job for free. It's not that at all. It's just the idea of stop using relentless crime and punishment as a method to combat the problems that we have, and instead redistribute the budget that the police have to a more effective and alternative way of addressing the problems that we have in society. And Tom does not believe this, though, and he says, this is a quote from his own article, that is lazily branding entire public service organisations as institutionally racist isn't constructive. And that for me is part of the problem, because this is another phrase that I'm sure that Tom would be happily dismissed due to it being lazy, but he is part of the problem. And I think it's actually lazier of him to have written this piece in the Ipswich Star without researching what institutional racism is and whether it is present in the police. And I'm confident that Tom hasn't done this, because if he had, he wouldn't have said that the lazy 389-page McPherson report was produced using over 100,000 pages of evidence shows that institutional racism doesn't exist. And it's so agonising to hear that someone who, is the MP of Ipswich hasn't researched anything of what he says. And without realising it, he's actually shown himself to be personification of institutional racism in the UK by his own denial of it. He's labelled the branding of institutional racism as lazy, despite there being extensive research into this. And the labelling of it as being lazy is actually unconscious bias in itself. And it is part of Tom's white privilege that he's never needed to understand that there is institutional racism for him to get to where he is in his life and career. And his discomfort and defensiveness, confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice, is another definition of white fragility. But by his very own ignorance to the meaning of these phrases, the saddening irony is that Tom Hunt proves by himself that it's far rifer than we actually realise. So I'm going to write to Tom Hunt, and I'm going to ask him to educate himself on institutional racism. I'm going to ask him what the current, if any, training policy is towards MPs for institutional racism, and I'm going to urge him to address that there is a problem with the training, because people like himself actually disagree that it is a problem, even though there's evidence that it is. And it's so frustrating, because we need to accept personal responsibility, but we also need to understand that Tom and the police officer who was caught laughing in camera in Ipswich and our town, even though they were at fault, it's part of a bigger problem and a bigger society and an institution that has let them down as individuals that we need to address.